Hi, 8th graders. Today we're going to do the last section in your chapter here, and it's 11.7, and we're dealing with cubed roots. Now, cubed roots you're going to work with more in algebra, so we need to introduce you to what this is. Now, we are really familiar what perfect squares are, and perfect squares are when we have a whole number that we multiply by itself, and we get this number, which we call the perfect square. Today, we're going to be talking about cubes. And a perfect cube is taking a number and a whole number and multiplying it by itself 3 times, and that's how we get the cube. And so in this case, I take 2, and 2 times 2 times 2, which is 2 to the third power, or we call it 2 cubed. And my final answer is 8 when I multiply that. Okay, so we have, it looks a little different when we take the cube of something. And so here we have our radical sign, which we're familiar with. The number underneath it is still called the radicand, but we have what is called the index number, and it sits above here, that little slash mark of the radical sign. And that's telling us that we are going to find the cube of that number. So we've got to stop and think, what whole number can I multiply by itself 3 times to get that radicand number? Okay, now here's the thing. Because we're multiplying a number by itself 3 times, our numbers can get very large quickly. So we're going to do some practice with this, okay? But before we do that, there are some distinguishing figures, some rules that we have that pertain to cube roots. And the first one is that any real number can exactly only have one cube root. Remember, when we dealt with squares, we could have a positive square root or we could have the negative square of it, okay? So we had positive and negative squares. Here with cube root, it can only have one. It's either a positive one or it's a negative. And the reason is down here. If you notice, if I have negative 2 cubed, when I multiply negative 2 times a negative 2 times a negative 2, my answer is negative 8. It can't become a positive 8. It is only negative. Okay, so whenever I take a cube root of a negative number, I know the answer is going to have to be a negative. Because remember our rules of multiplying positive and negatives. Any odd amount of negatives, my answer is always going to be negative. Okay, so that's a little bit different between working with square roots and cubes. Cubes, I can have an actual negative number for this, okay? So here we go. We want to go ahead and find, I'll just show it all to you. Let's do it that way. I want to find what is the cube root of 125. So what I'm going to do is ask myself, what whole number can I multiply 3 times by itself to get 25? And so what I did is start at, okay, we're at 125. So thinking, we want to start small because it multiplies quickly. And so we know 2 gives me 8. Okay, so that's out of the question. So sometimes if you really don't have an idea, go ahead and work with your small numbers, work your way up. But because it's 125, remember our rules that are of multiplication. Remember 5 and 0, that number ends up having to be ending in a 0 or a 5. So that kind of gives me a clue. Maybe I want to try 5. Okay, and so I went ahead and used my calculator and went 5 times 5 times 5 to see if it equaled 125. Same thing here. I now have a negative, I want to find the cube of negative 216. Now here's the clue, it's a negative, so I know my answer has to be negative. And because I just did 125, I know it's got to be higher than 5. So you're going to get comfortable knowing which numbers they end up being. And so I know 5, that's a good one to always remember. The cube of 5 is 125. So that kind of gives me an idea of what numbers to try. I definitely want to try numbers that are higher than 5. And remember, they get high very quickly. So I would start off with trying with 6. And once I put -6 times -6 times -6 into the calculator, I find out that my answer is -216. So some people like to say it's trial by error. It is, but we're going to make logical guesses of what we want to try. Remember, it gets very large very quickly. Okay, so now we're going to reverse it. Okay, and we're going to find the perfect cubes. And the perfect cube, finding it, is simply saying I'm taking that 12 and I'm going to multiply it by itself 3 times. So 12 times 12 times 12. Well, we're going to use our calculators and put it in to help us out. 12 times 12 times 12 ends up being 1,728. Remember how I said it got large very quickly. Now, in your calculator, you can go simply 12 times 12 times 12 and get the answer, or we can use our caret button here. So I'm going to go 12, hit the button, and put 3. And that will give me the cubed root of that. Okay, we've used that a few times in class, but just as a reminder, that's how we can put it in our calculator. So the same thing with -7 cubed. We know -7 times -7 is 49, but right off my head, I don't know what a positive 49 times a -7 is. So I'm going to go 47 times the -7. 7 times 7 is 49, not 47. I am thinking today, really. 49 times a -7 gives me -343. If you notice, the answer was negative, and it needed to be negative because I had that -7. Okay, so let's do 2 more problems here just to see if we're feeling comfortable with it. So here I have a -1,728. Okay, what number is this going to be? Well, if you notice, it's got a negative sign, so my final answer has to be negative. Okay, so we know that we just did our number up here, that a -7 gave me -343. Okay, I don't know if you remember, but what did we get for a 12? We got 1,728. So my answer for this one is -12. But what happens if you didn't remember that? Well, I would put in a number. Maybe let's try 9, okay? So if I go -9 to the 3rd power, I end up with -729. Well, I'm not there yet. And I know 10 cubed does not give me that number, so we could go ahead and try 11. So -11 to the 3rd power gives me 1,331. That means I am really close. So my next guess would have been 12, where I would have found out that was my answer. Okay, so we need to use educated thinking through what number to figure out here. Okay, so our last one is 512. What is the cubed of 512? Okay, so we know 5 cubed gives me 125. So we definitely want to go higher than that. So let's go ahead and let's try 8. Okay, let's see, and that'll give us a beginning point. So 8 raised to the 3rd power gives me, that was a good guess, 512. Okay, so when we think this through, we got to think through it logically, and we're asking what whole number multiplied by itself will give us the correct answer. If it is a negative underneath the radical sign, the answer has to be a negative. Okay, guys, if you've got questions, go ahead and email me and text me, and that is our lesson for the day.